When we think about the British Empire in India, we usually think about physical things. We think about the Koh-i-Noor diamonds sitting in the Tower of London. We think about the statues of Queen Victoria, or the grand railways and the architecture of New Delhi. We look at the crown jewels and we see them as the symbol of the wealth that was taken. But the truth is that the physical looting was just a distraction. The diamonds and the rubies and the gold statues were merely the loose change found in the sofa cushions. The real theft, the theft that changed the trajectory of human history, was not committed by soldiers looting palaces. It was committed by bankers sitting in quiet offices in London. It was not done with swords and muskets. It was done with exchange rates and tax policies. It was done by manipulating the price of silver and gold. Recent economic research by daring historians has put a number on this theft. The number is $45 trillion. That is $45 trillion drained from India to Britain between 1765 and 1938. To put that number in perspective, it is 17 times more than the total annual gross domestic product of the United Kingdom today. It is a sum of money so vast that it is almost impossible to comprehend. It was enough money to fund the Industrial Revolution, to fight 2 world wars, and to build the modern Western world. And it was all taken through a sophisticated financial scam that turned the entire Indian subcontinent into a mechanism for generating free money for the British Treasury. To understand how this scam worked, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand what the world looked like before the British arrived. In the early 18th century, India was the industrial workshop of the world. It produced 25% of the world's global manufacturing output. The textiles of Bengal were the finest in existence. The steel produced in the south of India was of a quality that European blacksmiths could not replicate. The shipyards of Gujarat built ships that were stronger and faster than anything in the Royal Navy. For centuries, the relationship between Europe and India was simple. Europe wanted Indian goods, but India did not want European goods. The British had nothing to sell that the Indians wanted. British wool was too hot for the Indian climate. British manufacturing was crude and primitive compared to Indian craftsmanship. So for hundreds of years, the trade was one way. British merchants would sail to India with ships full of silver and gold. They would pay the Indian merchants in hard bullion, and they would sail back with spices and textiles. For Europe, this was a problem. They were bleeding silver. India was known as the sink of the world's bullion. The Romans complained about it. The Spanish complained about it. And the British complained about it. The wealth of the world flowed east, and it stayed there. But in 1757, everything changed. The East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. Suddenly, a private corporation found itself the master of the richest province in Asia. In 1765, they acquired the Diwani, which was the right to collect taxes in Bengal. This was the moment the flow of the river reversed. This was the moment the drain began. Before 1765, the East India Company had to bring silver from London to buy Indian textiles. After 1765, they stopped bringing silver. Instead, they used the tax money they collected from the Bengal peasants to buy the goods. Think about what this means. The Indian peasant paid tax to the company. The company used that same money to buy the peasant's cloth. Then the company took the cloth and sold it in London for a massive profit. The Indians were essentially paying the British to take their goods away. It was a system of organized shoplifting where the victim provided the cash for the thief. But this was just the crude beginning. The British Empire realized that they could not just rely on simple taxation. They needed a more sophisticated system to extract wealth from an entire continent. They needed to control the currency itself. And this brings us to the great monetary tragedy of the 19th century. The war between silver and gold. For most of human history, silver and gold were both used as money. India was on the silver standard. The rupee was a silver coin. It contained a specific weight of pure silver. The British pound was largely on the gold standard. For a long time, this did not matter because the exchange rate between silver and gold was stable. Roughly 15 ounces of silver was worth 1 ounce of gold. This ratio had held steady for centuries. But in the 1870s, disaster struck the silver markets. Massive new silver mines were discovered in Nevada and Latin America, flooding the world with supply. At the same time, the newly formed German Empire decided to switch to the gold standard and dumped its massive reserves of silver onto the market. The price of silver collapsed. For a country like India, which held its wealth in silver, this was a catastrophe. The value of the rupee began to freefall against the British pound. In 1870, a rupee was worth about 2 shillings. By 1890, it had dropped to just over 1 shilling. The money in the pockets of the Indian people was losing half its value on the international market. If India had been an independent country, it could have protected itself. It could have put tariffs on imports, or it could have switched to the gold standard itself. But India was not independent. It was a colony run for the benefit of London. And the bankers in London saw the silver crisis not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. They realized they could use the difference between the silver rupee and the gold pound to create a mechanism of permanent debt. The mechanism was called the home charges. This was a bill that the Indian government had to pay to Britain every year. It was ostensibly a payment for the privilege of being ruled by Britain. India had to pay for the British Army stationed in India. India had to pay for the pensions of British officials who had retired back to London. India had to pay for the railway equipment that Britain sold them at inflated prices. And crucially, India had to pay interest on the massive debt that the British government had piled onto India. Here was the trap. The taxes in India were collected in silver rupees from the peasants. But the home charges had to be paid in gold pounds to London. As the price of silver crashed, the Indian government had to collect more and more rupees just to pay the same amount of debt in gold pounds. It was a treadmill that never stopped. If the rupee lost half its value, the peasant had to give up twice as much grain, twice as much cotton, and twice as much labor just to stay in the same place. The British government could have fixed this. They could have allowed India to adopt the gold standard. The Indian merchant class begged for it. They wanted a gold coin to compete with the British sovereign. But London refused. They deliberately kept India on a silver standard while the rest of the world moved to gold. Why did they do this? Because it was profitable for British trade. A cheap rupee meant that Indian exports were cheap for British buyers. It meant Britain could buy wheat and cotton and jute from India at rock-bottom prices. But it also meant that India could not afford to buy machinery or technology from the outside world because their currency was too weak. It kept India trapped as a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished British goods. It deindustrialized India by monetary policy. But the scam went deeper than just the exchange rate. It involved the physical removal of gold from India. The British government set up a system called council bills. This is a complex financial term for a simple trick. Imagine you are a British merchant in London and you want to buy tea from India. You have gold pounds. Normally, you would ship that gold to India to pay the Indian tea farmer. If you did that, India would become rich with gold. The gold reserves of India would grow. But the British government did not want gold flowing to India, so they intercepted it. They told the British merchant, "Do not send the gold to India. Instead, give the gold to the Secretary of State for India in London. In exchange, we will give you a piece of paper called a council bill. You post this piece of paper to India. When the Indian tea farmer receives it, he takes it to the colonial government in Kolkata, and they give him rupees that were printed in India, effectively out of thin air, from tax revenues. So what happened to the gold? The gold stayed in London. It was deposited in the Bank of England. It was used to back the British pound. It was used to lend to British businesses. It was used to fund the British Army. The gold that was supposed to pay for Indian goods never reached India. India got paper rupees, which fueled inflation locally, while London got the hard asset. This system effectively meant that India was exporting its goods for free. The gold that was supposed to enter India as payment was hijacked in London. Economists call this the absorption of India's balance of trade surplus. India was running a massive trade surplus with the world. They were selling far more than they were buying. By all the laws of economics, India should have been accumulating massive reserves of gold and becoming the world's banker. But because of the council bills, the gold was siphoned off to London. The impact of this on the Indian peasants was devastating. To pay their taxes in a currency that was constantly losing value, the peasants were forced to switch from growing food crops to growing cash crops for export. They stopped growing rice and wheat for their families and started growing cotton, opium, and indigo for the British Empire. They had to export to survive. They had to sell their grain to the global market to earn the silver to pay the tax to the British. This led to the horrifying spectacle of food leaving India during times of famine. In the late 19th century, a series of terrible famines swept across India. Millions of people died of starvation. In the Madras famine of 1877, roughly 5 million people perished. And yet, in that very same year, India exported a record amount of wheat to Britain. The telegraph lines and the railways, which the British claimed were gifts to India, were actually used to suck the grain out of the hinterlands and ship it to London. The railways were the straws through which the vampire drank the blood. Viceroy Lytton, who was in charge of India during the famine, famously refused to intervene. He believed in the free market. He believed that if the price of wheat was higher in London than it was in Madras, then the wheat should go to London. He argued that interfering with the market would make the peasants lazy. He insisted that the silver tax be collected with absolute rigidity. If a peasant could not pay, his land was confiscated. To save their land, peasants sold their family jewelry. They sold their wives' silver bangles. They sold the small amounts of gold they had saved for generations. This was the distress gold. During the famines, tons of gold flowed out of the villages of India and into the vaults of the Bank of England. The suffering of the Indian peasant was the liquidity that kept the British Empire solvent. When the London stock market crashed, or when the Bank of England needed to shore up its reserves, they would tighten the screws on India. They would contract the money supply in India, forcing interest rates up and forcing more gold out of the country. The British Empire was essentially a giant pyramid scheme, and India was the base of the pyramid. The stability of the British pound, sterling, the currency that ruled the world, was dependent on the surpluses stolen from India. Britain ran a trade deficit with the rest of the world. They bought more from the US and Europe than they sold. They should have been broke, but they balanced their books by taking India's surplus. They used India's earnings to pay for their own consumption. As we end the first part of this story, we see a system that is perfectly engineered for extraction. We see a currency manipulation that devalues the labor of millions. We see a tax system that forces the export of food while people starve. And we see the gold of the East being stacked in the vaults of the West. But the story does not end in the 19th century. As the world moved toward the world wars, the scale of the theft would increase. The British would find new ways to leverage Indian wealth to fight their wars. And in the final act of the empire, they would pull off one last financial trick that would wipe out the savings of a nation and leave independent India with a begging bowl. By the turn of the 20th century, the financial drain on India had become a well-oiled machine. The system of council bills and the manipulation of the silver rupee meant that London effectively had a blank check drawn on the resources of the subcontinent. But the geopolitical world was changing. The First World War was on the horizon, and the demands on the British Treasury were about to explode. The theft was about to shift from a steady stream to a torrential flood. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain needed two things desperately. It needed soldiers, and it needed money. India provided both. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the trenches of Europe and the deserts of the Middle East. But the financial contribution was even more staggering. The British government simply charged India for the cost of the war. They called it a gift. The Indian taxpayer paid for the recruitment, the equipment, and the transport of the troops who were fighting to defend the British Empire. This gift amounted to hundreds of millions of pounds. It was a gift given by a population that had no vote and no say in the matter. But the real financial crime of the 20th century occurred during and after the Second World War. This is a chapter of history that is rarely taught in British schools, but it remains a burning scar in the economic memory of India. It involves a concept known as the sterling balances. When World War II began in 1939, Britain was terrified. They knew they could not afford to fight Germany alone. They needed the resources of the entire empire. They turned India into a massive supply base for the war effort. Indian factories churned out uniforms, ammunition, and steel. Indian farmers grew food to feed the Allied armies. Britain needed these goods, but they had no money to pay for them. The British economy was shattered. They had no gold left to send to India. So they came up with a new system. They simply promised to pay later. Every time the British government bought goods from India, they credited the payment to a bank account in the Bank of England in London. These were the sterling balances. It was essentially an IOU. India was lending Britain the money to fight the war. The Indian Reserve Bank printed rupees to pay the local suppliers in India, causing massive inflation within India, while the British government deposited paper promises in a vault in London. By the end of the war in 1945, this debt had become colossal. Britain owed India £1.25 billion. In today's money, that is hundreds of billions of dollars. It was a reversal of history. After 2 centuries of looting, Britain had become the debtor and India was the creditor. India had technically paid for its own occupation and financed the British war effort to the point where Britain was deeply in debt to its own colony. Logic would dictate that when the war ended and India became independent, Britain would pay back this money. This capital could have been used to kickstart the Indian economy. It could have built dams and power plants and universities. It was the accumulated savings of a nation that had been starved and overworked for the war effort. During the Bengal famine of 1943, where 3 million people died, Winston Churchill continued to divert shipping and food supplies away from India to reserve stockpiles for Europe. The food that could have saved those 3 million people was bought with these IOUs. The sterling balances were literally soaked in blood. But when the war ended, the British government looked at the debt and decided they simply did not want to pay it. Or rather, they could not pay it without damaging their own standard of living. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who is often celebrated as a liberal genius, played a dark role in this. He advised the British government on how to handle the Indian debt. He privately expressed contempt for the Indian claims. He suggested that perhaps the debt should be cancelled or written down. He argued that India should have contributed to the war effort anyway. In the end, Britain did not default openly, because that would have destroyed the credibility of the pound sterling globally. Instead, they did something more insidious. They blocked the balances. When India became independent in 1947, the new Indian government asked for their money. The British said, "No. You cannot have it all at once. We will release it to you in tiny drops over many years." They froze the assets. Then came the second part of the trick, devaluation. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound against the dollar. Because the Indian rupee was pegged to the pound, the value of India's savings crashed overnight. By delaying the repayment and then devaluing the currency, Britain effectively wiped out a massive percentage of the debt. They paid back India with money that was worth a fraction of what it had been when the goods were taken. It was the final grand larceny of the empire. This financial maneuvering had devastating consequences for the newly independent India. India started its life as a free nation with a massive handicap. The capital that should have been available for development was locked up in London, losing value every day. India faced a severe dollar shortage. They could not import the technology they needed from America because their wealth was trapped in British pounds. This forced India into a closed economy. It forced them to adopt restrictive economic policies just to survive. The poverty of post-independence India was not just a result of bad local policies. It was a direct result of the capital starvation engineered by London. The legacy of this silver and gold manipulation is still visible today. The $45 trillion figure calculated by economists is not just a number on a page. It represents the lost potential of a civilization. If that wealth had remained in India and had been invested in India at normal rates of compound interest, India would likely be a first world nation today. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain, was fueled by Indian capital. The steam engines of Manchester and the railways of Liverpool were built on the back of the Indian silver drain. Historians often talk about the benefits of empire. They talk about the railways and the law and the English language. But if you look at the ledger, the railway was a tool of extraction, not a gift of charity. It was built with Indian tax money, at inflated costs to benefit British steel manufacturers. And it was designed to carry goods out of the country, not to move people around it. The silver trick was the master key. By keeping India on a depreciating silver standard, while the masters held gold, Britain ensured that the terms of trade would always be against the colony. It was a rigged casino where the house not only set the odds, but also changed the value of the chips whenever they started losing. Even the concepts of Third World and First World are a product of this history. We look at India today and see a developing nation, and we look at Britain and see a developed nation. We assume this is due to culture, or geography, or innovation. But the financial history shows us that it was a transfer. One nation developed at the expense of the other. The development of the West was paid for by the underdevelopment of the East. The council bill system, the home charges, the distress gold flows, and the sterling balances were the gears of a machine designed to strip a continent bare. It was clean. It was legal. It was done with accountants and treaties. There were no massacres required to move the gold. Just a signature on a piece of paper in surmise. When the British finally left India in 1947, they left behind a country with a literacy rate of 12% and a life expectancy of 32 years. They left a country that had experienced zero per capita income growth for 2 centuries. They left a country that had been transformed from the world's manufacturer into a destitute supplier of raw materials. And as the Union Jack came down and the Indian flag went up, the vaults of the Bank of England remained full of the gold that had once backed the rupees of the Bengal peasant. The story of the silver rupee and the gold pound is the story of how the modern world was built. It is a story that challenges the narrative of Western superiority. It shows that the invisible hand of the market was guided by the iron fist of the empire. And it reminds us that in a game of nations, the most powerful weapon is not the gun, but the currency. The $45 trillion is gone. It can never be repaid. But understanding how it was taken is the first step in reclaiming the history that was stolen along with it. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Don't forget to subscribe. Join those who see what others